Northeast Texas, cotton and cattle country. Northeast Texas, Sam Rayburn country. A farm boy from Bonham who became a major force in national politics, but never forgot nor neglected the people at home who sent him to Washington.
Well, I suppose I've been called a lot of things over the years by my colleagues and friends.
Mr. Speaker!
And maybe by a few who didn't like me all that much. Mr. Congressman, Mr. Speaker, New Deal warrior, bald eagle from Bonham. But my friends called me just plain Mr. Sam. I served with 8 presidents, from Woodrow Wilson to John Kennedy, as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 49 years. I was around a long time because my friends and neighbors kept right on electing me. I worked hard in Washington and enjoyed it, mostly. But thoughts of my home and family back in Texas were never far away.
Mr. Sam was born in Tennessee in 1882, but the family moved to Northeast Texas when he was 5. He was number 8 of 11 children. As a young man, Sam was fascinated by politicians and their dramatic speech-making. He soon decided politics and the law would be his future, and he never wavered in his determination. Rayburn ran for a seat in the Texas legislature as a Democrat and won by 163 votes. The start of the longest lawmaking career in American history. In 1912, Sam was elected to the United States House of Representatives, and he was re-elected 23 times. He never lost an election from this point on. Sam realized his long-held dream when he became Speaker of the House in 1940, a role acknowledged by his fellow Democrats and Republicans alike, in which he excelled. In fact, when Republicans gained control of the House in 1947, and Sam no longer had the use of the official Speaker's limousine, almost 200 House members, including 50 Republicans, chipped in to buy him a new Cadillac Fleetwood, one of his most prized possessions. He returned the Republicans' donations with his thanks to avoid any hint of conflict of interest. As Speaker, he greatly influenced how bills introduced by congressmen representing the entire nation made their way through the House to a final vote. But he never lost sight of his own constituents' needs. He worked tirelessly to win passage of legislation for soil conservation, improved farm-to-market roads, and rural electrification. Sam said, "I want my people out of the mud and out of the dark." He considered his work in passing this legislation his greatest achievement because it helped those he called the real people, farmers and small-town people who, to him, were the strength and backbone of the nation.
Around 1,200 years ago, Native Americans, known today as the Hassene Caddo, established a village here on the banks of the Neches River in East Texas. The location provided access to extensive trade routes and to lands rich with fertile soil, abundant game, fish, and water. This village developed into a major ceremonial center and flourished for the next 500 years. At its height, an elite class of spiritual and political leaders governed a population of 600 to 900 farmers, hunters, and craftspeople. During this time, corn became a major crop. The bow and arrow, which allowed for more efficient hunting, replaced the spear, and pottery was created to serve everyday purposes and artistic expression. As the village grew, 3 mounds were constructed that marked important ceremonial areas. The burial mound, where community leaders were interred, grew over time. As each generation of religious and political leaders died and were buried, the mound grew in height. The two other mounds were temple or ceremonial platforms used for religious activities and community gatherings. They were also built up slowly over time. All three of the mounds were considerably larger at the end of the Caddo occupation of the site than they are today. There may have been more than 150 houses in the village, and extended family groups may have lived in each of them. The location of Caddo mounds made it a hub for trade with other groups. The Caddo traded bodark wood used to make bows, pottery vessels, salt, and corn for exquisite stone objects, shells, copper, and ceremonial objects from as far away as Illinois. It is not known why, after 5 centuries, the Caddo political system waned and the site was abandoned. The Caddo lived on in the area, but they were widely dispersed into smaller villages. The mounds remained on the open prairie as a witness to the elaborate social structure of an earlier time. When the Spanish arrived in the area, they used existing Caddo trade routes as their roads through the region. One such route became known as El Camino Real de los Tejas, or the Royal Road of the Tejas Indians, which is what the Spanish called the Caddo Indians of the region.
From where do our heroes come? How is it they seem to appear at the very moment they are most needed? Heroes like Dwight David Eisenhower of Denison, Texas, born to a nearly destitute blue-collar family, who rose to a long and distinguished military and political career. As 5-star general of the Army, he was the architect for the defeat of Nazi Germany,
Dwight D. Eisenhower,
and later 34th President of the United States, the first to be born in the state of Texas. Eisenhower, affectionately known as Ike, began his military career with an appointment to West Point. He graduated with the class of 1915, later called the class stars fell on, because almost half of these new lieutenants later became generals. With World War II underway, Eisenhower had risen to brigadier general. He was chosen by President Roosevelt to plan and carry out the first U.S. offensive against Nazi Germany, the invasion of North Africa. In 1943, he was named to lead the armies of 12 nations to liberate Western Europe. The assault began on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944 and ended a year later with Germany's unconditional surrender. At war's end, Eisenhower served with distinction as Army Chief of Staff and later became president of Columbia University. In 1950, Ike returned to active duty to head the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. As the 1952 presidential election approached, Ike was very much in demand by both parties, but chose to run as a Republican. He won by a landslide. He was re-elected in 1956 to a second term by even a larger majority. Eisenhower is credited with speeding the end of the Korean conflict, implementation of the interstate highway system, completing integration of the armed services, creation of NASA as a civilian space agency, and passage of significant civil rights legislation. He was a champion for freedom-loving people everywhere. So where did this great man come from? Baby Ike arrived at the house on the corner of South Lamar and East Day Streets October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas. It was the arrival of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, the Katy, in 1872 that turned Denison into an important gateway for the country's westward expansion. Thanks to the Katy and the town's strategic location on the Red River, Denison's population of less than 4,000 in 1880 grew to almost 11,000 by the time the Eisenhowers arrived in 1889. The prospect of a job with Acadie brought Ike's parents, David and Ida, to Texas after economic reverses in Kansas. The only work David could find was as a laborer, wiping down and lubricating arriving locomotives. At a salary of less than $10 a week, the family found it difficult to make ends meet. They rented a very modest two-story house in a working-class, multi-ethnic neighborhood with railroad tracks only steps away from their front door. The many passing trains kept the house coated with a thick layer of soot, inside and out. This period was the economic low point of their married life, but Ida was resourceful and a good manager, and the family survived.
The prisoner of war camp located at Hereford was built for the Italian prisoners of war.
They were Italian prisoners brought over here from Africa.
When they first came, the whole town was just a little bit afraid because they were prisoners, you know.
They never gave us 1 minute to be afraid.
But when the women got to knowing them, my mother had no fear, so why should I have fear?
They were very gentlemanly.
They were nice-looking young men, except that it had the big old POWs printed on their back of their shirts.
In Italy, there's more artists than there are doctors and lawyers. And at the prisoner of war camp, there were many artists, many talents. The prisoners of war artists that worked at St. Mary's Church at Dumbarger, when they saw this plain church, not anything in it but just white walls, they wanted to decorate it as fast as they could.
Father says, well, I tell you what, we cannot pay you, but we can feed you. And, you know, how's the quickest way to a man's heart is through his tummy. And they did a beautiful job. And when we looked through the door, they were whistling and singing.
I was 14 years old. That's how old I was when they were doing this. When I was here at one time, one of the Italians came up to me and asked for a dime. Well, in about a week later, they came back with this piece of jewelry, and it's got figures on the front and on the back, and so I've treasured it. One of the prisoners asked my mother for a 50-cent piece, and he made this ring for her. Well, she was so proud of it, it's got her initials on it. And she brought it home, and my dad said, "What, you take a ring from another man?" So it got put in the dresser drawer, and I found it after she had died when we were cleaning out the house.
There are very few of them left. I still correspond with 3, but they're in their late 90s. And they think I'm a spring chicken at 80. And they said, we left part of our youth at the church in all of those paintings. And what a magnificent way to leave something.